Hello, BookTube. I've got more thrift shop finds for you today, four of them. All recommendations, starting with The Writings of St. Paul in the Norton Critical Edition. And really, my recommendation of this volume would stand instead for all of Norton Critical Editions because they are wonderful. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, they are the text of whatever work is being reprinted, and then essays spanning centuries, if the work is old enough, of critical responses, analyses, sometimes parodies. It's the perfect way of taking an old text and putting it in literary context. It never fails to please me. This volume starts off with the writings of St. Paul, the vile madman who was the founder of Christianity, and then has an array. St. Paul has evoked some of the greatest theological writers in history to respond to him, and they're all in here. The only fault I can assess to it is that it had to be published, so it had to cut off its reprints at some point or other. Great writing about St. Paul has continued for the 35 or 40 years since this came out. So an update would be good. Our next one is The Boilerplate Rhino by David Quammen. And much like the first book, this can stand instead for anything that David Quammen has written. He's a natural history writer. He's the best natural history writer working today. And his books are endlessly fascinating. Anything that he turns his attention to, he can turn into gold by the power of his pen. And this is no exception. This is a collection of natural history essays, but the subject of the title is a rhinoceros that was sent by an Indian sultan to the port of Lisbon in 1515. It caused a stir. It didn't live long. Died at sea. And rumor of it reached the ear of the great painter Albert Durer, who decided to paint it anyway, even though he hadn't seen it. So you had to imagine this thing, and Quammen writes about it. Having heard that the rhinoceros was plated protectively with panels of stiff skin, he gave it a suit of armor. And not just any armor, but armor closely analogous to what a German knight would have worn in the feudal scuffles of Durer's own era, complete with a breastplate around the midsection, pauldrons for shoulders, falds skirting the thighs, and nicely aligned rivets along the plate edges. He canted back the angle of the horn, making it more dangerous as a weapon for hooking and ripping. He applied arabesques of detail and no small amount of gnarly menace to the face. For good measure, he added a second horn, smaller, pointing forward from the back of the neck. The lower legs he wrapped in chainmail. As Durer imagined and portrayed it, the rhinoceros was a magnificent aggressor, surly, invulnerable, built to cause terror wherever it strode, a war rhino. That's uncanny for someone who's never seen them. That's just what they're like. Our next one is Original Sin by P.D. James. She's, of course, wrote a shelf of mystery novels. They're all fantastic. This is my favorite because it's set in the publishing industry and has one of the joys of P.D. James is never the whodunit. It's the wheredunit. It's the setting that she gives and all the vicious, icy asides that she makes when she sets up one world after another for examination. And this one, writing, publishing, it's mercilessly laid bare. I don't know how her publisher published it back in the mid-90s without blushing in shame. Maybe they did, for all I know. And the last one is Who Killed Classical Music by Norman Lebrecht. An analysis from years ago. This is, I think, 20 years ago. 30 years ago, of the classical music industry by its foremost scold and one of its most intelligent critics, whose work you can find every week at Open Letters Monthly. He writes about the corporate takeover of the classical world and the damage that it's done. And everywhere in it, the bounce of his prose is just irresistible. What chance did classical music stand in this onslaught? Internal optimists argued it was too small to interest corporate imperialists and would be allowed to play on regardless. But then optimism can seldom be trusted in a revolutionary age. Classical music, as this book has shown, got swept up in the early hours of the fire sale of Western culture. It may have been minuscule, but it was a prestigious asset, and without it, no cultural conglomerate could call itself comprehensive. Sucked into the corporate maw, classical music was ruthlessly subsidiarized and subjected to the remote control of know-nothing bean counters, its agenda dictated from without. The totalitarian reality of restricted cultural ownership by a handful of shifting global entities was taking on Orwellian dimensions, and the smaller the art form, the more defenseless it appeared. The reports of classical music's death were a bit premature. You need people like Norman Lebrecht to sound warning signs like this, but of course there are small labels like Channel Classics that go on producing great stuff and that aren't corporatized at all. But still, bracing. And unfortunately, every bit as relevant today as it was when it was written. And there you have it. 4 gems from the thrift shops. If you see them and they sound of interest, you should grab them. And there'll be more to come, although I think more new books are in order next time. Thanks.